you have erupted into the public eye for your work on what is called mass formation. Some will have heard it discussed as mass formation psychosis, but I don't think that's the general term. So what I would like is for you to describe the process of mass formation and what it has to do with certain patterns of history that everybody who watches this will already be familiar with, even if they don't realize that they are in fact patterns.
Yes, indeed. I never use the term mass formation psychosis because I think both from an intellectual and an ethical point of view, and even a strategical point of view, it is better to use the term mass formation, which is a more neutral term, less stigmatizing, which doesn't enter the domain of individual psychodiagnostics and so on. So I prefer the term mass formation.
Excellent. I think that's right. The one downside to it is that it does not immediately call anything to mind for most people. Right. Psychosis obviously does, but I agree with you. Psychosis is prejudicial and counterproductive.
Mass formation it's a specific kind of group formation, which has very specific effects at the level of individual mental functioning. For instance, if people are in the grip of a process of mass formation, they tend to become radically blind for everything that goes against the narrative the group believes in. It is as if they don't have any capacity anymore to take a critical distance of what the group believes in. And this holds even for people who are extremely intelligent and highly educated. So that's one of the strangest things of mass formation. Even the higher the level of education, it has been observed time and time again, the more vulnerable people become for mass formation, which is quite strange, of course. Then a second characteristic, a very important characteristic of mass formation, is that as people are in the grip of it, they typically become willing to self-sacrifice. It is as if they are no longer aware of their own individual interests, as if they are willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of the collective interests, and to a very extreme extent. And a third crucial phenomenological characteristic of mass formation is that people who are in the grip of it typically become radically intolerant for dissonant voices. And in the end, this goes quite far. In the end, people who are in the grip of mass formation typically start to commit cruelties and atrocities towards the people that do not go along with the masses. And even more specific, they do so as if it is an ethical duty to do so. That's typical for masses of all times, whether we are talking about the Crusades or the witch hunts or the French Revolution or the emergence of the masses in the Soviet Union or in Nazi Germany. Every time you see the same characteristic, after a while, when the mass formation becomes very deep, people typically start to commit cruelties towards those who do not go along with them, and they do so as if it is an ethical duty. To give only one example, 2 months ago, I was talking with this woman of Iran, and this conversation is available on the internet, who lived in Iran during the revolution in 1979, which was the beginning of a large-scale process of mass formation in Iran. And she described how she had seen with her own eyes how a mother reported her son to the state, and how she hung the rope around his neck when he was on the scaffold, and how she claimed to be a heroine for doing so. That's a process that the typical end point of mass formation is that, in a strange way, people are willing to commit cruelties towards everyone who doesn't go along with the masses, and they do so as if it is an ethical duty to do so. All right. So that's purely the phenomenological characteristics of mass formation. But as soon as I think that shows how extremely important it is.
Well, let's pause there for a second. I want you to complete describing the model. I think it's very important that you get the whole thing on the table. But I want to point out that what you've described so far is a series of paradoxes where things that do not appear to make sense become apparent driving forces of important historical processes. And what I hope we will get to is an explanation for why those things are in fact not paradoxical, why they make sense in an evolutionary context, even though they seem utterly absurd to an observer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we will try to. At least I can describe the mechanism of mass formation. That's what I did in my book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism, which was recently published. I go into the mechanism, the psychological mechanism, and I'm very curious to your ideas about the biological mechanisms of mass formation. But I go into the psychological mechanisms of mass formation in order to show actually that these strange, seemingly utterly absurd characteristics at the phenomenological level can be explained in a psychological way and start to make sense. And maybe, well, it's important to stipulate from the beginning that mass formation exists as long as mankind exists. It exists as long as mankind exists, but the modern masses are not the same as the ancient masses. There are very important differences that are crucial from a psychological perspective. For instance, the ancient masses were masses that gathered physically. They gathered physically. The individuals that constituted the mass were physically present or were physically together. And the modern masses are what are sometimes called lonely masses. Modern masses are very often created through the mass media. Modern masses are groups of people that all share the same ideas, that are all in the grip of the same images, that are all in the grip of the same narratives and myths, but that never physically gather, that often live in a rather isolated state. And it is exactly this state of individuals in a lonely mass what makes them extremely susceptible and extremely vulnerable for all kinds of propaganda. It's a perfect state in which you can reach someone with propaganda and take in the grip of propaganda. So that's an important thing. And as soon as you start to understand that the phenomenon of mass formation is the basis of what we call totalitarian states, you start to understand how extremely important it is to understand what mass formation is and how it works. And also why it's only the mechanism of mass formation that allows us to explain why totalitarian states emerged for the first time in the 20th century. Before the 20th century, there were classical dictatorships, but there were no totalitarian states. And the difference between a classical dictatorship and a totalitarian state is exactly at the psychological level that the totalitarian state is based on mass formation, on the emergence of a mass or a crowd, which, led by certain leaders, can seize control of society. While a classical dictatorship is very primitive in its psychological mechanism. In a classical dictatorship, the population is just scared of a small group, of the aggressive potential of a small group, and accepts, therefore, that the small group imposes its social contract unilaterally. In a totalitarian state is based on a completely different psychological process, namely the process of mass formation. Is it okay, Bret, if I just, in a concise way, in a nutshell, describe the process of mass formation, the mechanism?
Yep. Before you do, though, I just want to highlight something that you said there about the difference between this process in ancient masses versus modern masses, and point out that what you're really describing is the perfect storm that emerged in COVID, where people who were literally confined to their homes more than they had ever been before had intense opinions about people they had never met, would never meet. They had opinions about technologies that they did not understand. In fact, some of the few excursions that they made were to source these technologies that had biological implications they couldn't hope to fathom. And so there is something about this modern technological moment, reflected, of course, in the conversation that you and I are having. We're having a face-to-face conversation thousands of miles apart. And so those kinds of technologies, I would argue, have simply interfaced with this apparently ancient mechanism, and they have actually facilitated and amplified its power in a modern context in a way that presumably nobody understood was likely.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
All right. So you were going to describe.
I couldn't agree more. The COVID situation was the perfect situation for people to get in the grip of this process of mass formation and in the grip of a narrative that was distributed through the mass media. Yes.
And the audience of this podcast will be highly non-random, and they will be people overwhelmingly who have, over the course of the last couple of years, had a large number of interactions where people that they thought they knew appear to believe perfectly bizarre things and to be immune to the detection that those things are not supported by the evidence. It's the most remarkable experience to look someone you know well in the eye and to not be able to understand how they could possibly believe the things that they seem to.